series, Diversity and Inclusion in TV, Radio and Film. As a woman of Pakistani heritage who's got over 25 years experience working in TV, radio and film, I know firsthand the hurdles and the challenges that people from diverse communities who work in this business have to overcome. The purpose of my interview series is to make more visible all the diverse talent that is working behind the scenes and creating all this magic, and to have them share their experiences, their thoughts and opinions on this very important subject matter, and discuss how the creative communities the creative industry can create an open and equal workplaces free of prejudice. Let me introduce you to my guest today, who's going to talk about his experiences. He's worked across radio and podcasts. He's worked at some huge radio stations, BBC Asian Network, BBC London Radio, Talk Radio, and now he's production director at 1129 Media. Hi, Mark. Hi, Mark Machado. Welcome, Mark Machado. How are you doing?
Hi, Samina. Thanks for having me today. I'm great.
Good. It's great to have you. So, Mark, tell me, you've worked across both disciplines, radio and podcasts. What's your experience been?
So I'll talk about radio first. In radio, I go to most of the newsrooms I've worked in. I'll be honest, you work at Asian Network. There's obviously, as you'd imagine, there's quite a lot of diversity within that newsroom. Radio London isn't quite as good as Asian Network, but Asian Networks, I suppose, is an exceptional case. But there's a reasonable amount of diversity there. Then you go to somewhere like Talk Radio and Talk Sport. There's not a huge amount of diversity there. I know there are initiatives that Wireless Group are putting in to try and get more diversity into the newsroom, but I definitely think it's well worth having these conversations, because you want to see, I want to see diversity not just on air but off air as well, and diversity in terms of storytelling, in terms of the stories that get spoken about on radio as well.
Well, you're somebody of Asian heritage, so how have you penetrated these arenas where there isn't as much diversity in radio?
My first kind of steps in professional radio were in Asian Network, which is obviously set up to service the British Asian community. So as you know, my dad's Sri Lankan and my mum's Anglo-Indian, so it was somewhere that was a natural fit for me. It's when and then from there I was able to kind of move on to working at Radio London, and then onto commercial radio. So I think for me the crucial step on the ladder was the first one. So it was important to have Asian Network there right at the beginning of my career as somewhere where I can get involved in, and then build out my kind of portfolio of work, I suppose, a little bit, to move on to somewhere else, to get the experience I needed to move on to somewhere else. So for me the key thing was Asian Network.
So what's interesting here, BBC Asian Network, as you pointed out, is directed at the Asian communities. So all the content they produce, it's to be of interest of the British Asian communities. Now, in order to serve that population, that part of the population, the people who are producing, are involved in behind the scenes, they need to be able to know what kind of stories to speak to this audience. Now, is this because of your heritage you were able to get into the Asian Network? So essentially your heritage helped you get into the Asian Network.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose like the Asian Network, they don't only employ exclusively British Asian people. They employ people from all over the place, and they've had people from all over the place work at the station as well. But obviously it's vital for them to have a certain percentage of their of their workforce be from the British Asian diaspora, so that as you say, I'd imagine if I was from a Polish background, it probably would have been difficult to get a job there, but luckily I used it to my advantage.
Yeah, so what's interesting here, what I'm trying to understand here is, because the Asian Network is targeting its content at the Asian communities in the UK. I mean, is that what it takes to create networks targeting specific communities in order to create diversity in the workplace? I mean, why isn't that happening across the other radio stations?
Yeah, so it shouldn't be the case, right? I think if you look at the history of how Asian Network came to be, it basically spun out, I think, of Radio Leicester, I think, about 25 years ago or something like that. And then it just got so big, the BBC had to basically make it into a national service. And that's when it ended up feeding, I suppose, staff to the rest of the BBC. And if you look at commercial radio in particular, has a much bigger problem with diversity than the BBC does. And maybe you could argue that there is no capital Asian or capital Desi, and that's why there isn't a huge amount of Asian presenters and producers at Global, or the same for Bauer. Maybe it's time to have absolute Bollywood, and then we'd get a lot of Asian presenters and producers across the Bauer network. Who knows? But I also think that the issue with having Asian network, and I do acknowledge this, even though I'm generally a fan of what they do, is that it means that all the Asian content is focused in one place on the BBC. And actually, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of great stories that are covered on Asian network, and a lot of great people, both on air and off air, who could do a great job at a number of other different stations and would like the opportunity at a number of other different stations. And maybe they get siloed into it. But I think overall, in terms of having it, is a good idea, and maybe it's something that other stations or other radio groups could possibly look at, because we do know there is a market for Asian radio, because obviously Asian commercial stations exist, like, for example, Sunrise Radio in Southall, or I think it's Subrash Radio in Leicester. These stations exist and make money because they've existed for a long time. So maybe it's something commercial radio needs to embrace as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point you make, because if these other stations targeting Asian communities, there's a captive audience to be had, and that's a business proposition. So the mainstream, they're potentially missing out on business, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, this is something I worry about a lot, right? Because I think that what's happening to our community is that our community has been siloed, almost, and it's been kind of othered by the rest of kind of mainstream radio, right? So if you are listening, if you're a young British Asian person in Southall, I'm just picking on West London because it's the area I know best, right? If you're a young British Asian person in West London, you might turn on to Capital Radio, and you won't see yourself reflected within that station. But then you might turn on to Sunrise, and that what you listen from, what you get from that station might not necessarily reflect your experience exactly, but it's much closer to it. You can kind of relate to the characters a bit more, right? On it. And that's why I feel like the British Asian story, our experiences and our culture, instead of are being pushed to a side. And in a way, I think it's having two impacts. Firstly, it's stopping our integration with the wider culture, but also it's just making us much more insular, and next time there is an issue within the Asian community, the rest of society points fingers at us, and it's like, well, hold on, we need to be able to adapt and move in. Compare and contrast that to the way that from what I see, and obviously I'm not part of it, but from what I see within the Black British community, where they work together and have been they've had to kick the doors down themselves, but they're much more integrated. Their culture seems to be much more integrated with wider society than the British Asian culture is.
And why do you think that is, Mark?
I think firstly, we allow it to happen. I think within a community, as a community, we don't support each other. Definitely not the way I see Black British people support each other. We do not have that
cohesion.
Cohesion, that's the word I was looking for. We don't have that cohesion, and I also think there's a sense within the community of, that person's got that job, so they've got one token Asian person, so there's no way they'd have two token Asian people. And I just think we need to, as a community, we need to change our mindsets for that. But also, on the flip side of it, the people who run radio stations, the people who run TV stations need to reach out and be, right, how do I get this involved? How do I get involved, and how do I engage this community?
And tell me, Mark, as you mentioned earlier, well, first I'd like to acknowledge what you've just said, that there are some cultural issues within, say, the Asian communities in terms of a certain particular mindset about penetrating the mainstream when it comes to careers. And also there's a responsibility of the mainstream people, the people who make decisions, the hirers, the hiring managers, to reach out to these communities. Now, how do you think that can be done, beyond the initiatives that already exist in a sustained way, not just some tokenistic initiative. And, we need to have it all needs to be checked and verified to make sure things are progressing.
I think the first thing they can do is when people are hiring, we need to within, and this isn't just a problem in radio. I think this is across all media platforms. Nepotism needs to just stop. It needs to just stop giving jobs to people who are mates, kids of your mates, or people you know. Firstly, that's not helping your diversity, but secondly, it's also just not good business practice. I mean, no large successful corporate behaves in such a way. So we just need to stop. We need to somehow stop that. Again, that's difficult in commercial because you can't tell a privately run organisation how they should employ people, right? They've got their own right to do it. And I think the second thing that needs to do is we need to have blind CVs applications. So they need to be blind to names, and they need to be blind possibly to even like where, in terms of where you live and what your kind of school background is. That doesn't mean you can't have your qualifications on it, but in terms of where you went to school and stuff like that, that needs to.
So Mark, can I just interrupt you there? Because, I've been reading up a lot about this, doing a lot of research. And one of the counter arguments to the blind CVs, I mean, you've made the very positive argument for it. One of the counter arguments is that it may well have the opposite effect to what is desired. So, for example, you remove the name, you removed, the area, but those people from Asian communities, from more diverse communities, tend not to be as high up the socioeconomic ladder as many of their white counterparts. So potentially, if the experience or the education or whatever isn't on the CV, then it potentially could exclude them.
You can. What I'm saying is, put your education on. So if you've got 10 GCSEs, put it on, but don't necessarily put your name of your school on. So
you've only got 2 GCSEs, but you've got all the passion in the world to be able to do what you want to do. And actually, you may well have better ideas than the person who's better educated than you.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe then what we need to do is specifically for the area that we're talking about is look to have, and actually most people do this anyway, because when I've employed people, I've almost never looked at their CVs. Just if I have, it's just to get their name, which I'm weirdly saying we should blank out. But I almost never look at the CVs, but what you should be doing is creating that body of work where you go, these are my ideas, and that's what people should be asking for, right? So the first question should be, say if I'm looking to employ someone to be a producer for a drive time show, I should say, what are your ideas for it? What are the stories we aren't covering? And actually, when I've been in that hiring position, that's what I've looked for. I've been like, what do they want us to talk about? What is their how are they thinking? What is their editorial judgment? That's what I'm more interested in than where they went to uni or what their name is. I think the other thing to consider is actually within broadcasting, there's a couple of university master's courses that have probably monopolized. I've probably got about 70% of all recent applicants for entry level jobs, which I think needs to stop as well.
Yeah, and how do you propose that happens?
Well, I just think because there's only about 5 different organisations that employ journalists en masse in the UK, they just need to get together and be like, right, we've got to have a quota system for how many people we can take from these courses. I'm not saying they need to stop it all totally, because I think that's unfair for people who are on those courses. But I think, just because you've done a course, that means you're taught to do journalism in a certain way. But as we all know, there are many different ways to skin a cat.
And do you think it's perhaps a concern that there's certain checkbox exercises taking place within the industry? For example, you get one person from a diverse background on your team, and that's the box checked, because that is then potentially closing the door to other very talented individuals within the diverse communities of the UK. And there's many talented people within diverse communities in the UK that they're not going to get a look in. They've got that, I hesitantly use the word tokenistic, but they've got that one bit of representation.
Yeah.
And then the door shuts for the others.
So I've got 2 thoughts about this, right? I kind of agree. I agree very much with what you're saying, but I'm also, my other thought is if you're in an organisation that has very little diversity, then actually I think you don't need people like me to say, do you know what? You need to have this tick box thing in. You should be thinking, we need to have this tick box in. Because ultimately, if you're a media organisation, you create content that's meant to reflect back to society. And as I said earlier, you're just not reflecting society if your newsroom is full of middle-aged, pale white men. It's just not going to... It's not working for anyone, that. So you need and I think what you'll find is, what should happen is, once you've got one person from a different background, you'll hopefully go, do you know what, that person's added a little bit to the conversation that we have, the editorial conversations. Let's get someone else in. Let's try and just broaden it out. Let's try and get a broad scope of people in to reflect what society is.
So, Mark, what are your thoughts about the people from diverse backgrounds who are already in the business and they're doing, very well for themselves? Do you think there's a responsibility on them to actively reach out to whether people are entry level or already in the business from diverse backgrounds and help them up the career ladder?
I think there is. I think most people from a diverse background, and even quite a few people who aren't from, are from the indigenous population, I think they are trying to do their best to increase diversity within their organisations and reach people. I think there's also, the one thing I would say is, I've done a lot of work around South Asian audio creatives, and we managed to engage quite a number of well-known people and less well-known people, but who are in positions of seniority within organisations. And a lot of the conversations we have with them is, we want to help, but actually we don't want to be seen as being disruptive within our organisation. And I get that as well. I mean, I can't expect everyone to be doing, to be knocking on their boss's door going, why haven't you employed more people from a diverse background? You do what you can, when you can, how you can, and hopefully... I don't think this issue, and I think it's actually a much bigger issue than people realise, is going to be solved overnight. I don't think this is a case of, right, let's take an audit of diversity today and then look at it in a month's time. I think it's, let's take an audit today and look at it in a year's time and 2 years' time and 3 years' time. I think it's going to be a slow process, which changes the way people think over a longer period of time.
And so, you talked to me before we began this interview about your particular project. Can you just give us more details of that?
Yes, the South Asian Audio Creatives was set up with me and a few other people as well. We basically looked at all the national radio stations, both commercial and the BBC, and we basically just noted down how many presenters they had who were from a South Asian background, and there was, it almost looked like binary code, because there was a lot of zeros and a few ones. And I think, apart from, we did say Radio 4 stands out because they've got a huge amount of diversity across their station, but most other stations were really struggling for much diversity, which, to be honest, I knew diversity was bad, but I didn't realise quite how bad it was. And hopefully, we're still trying to figure out what our next steps are going to be. We will continue, in 9 months' time. I think we did it we did it in December. So in a year's time, next December, we'll look at it again and see how far we've got. I already know Radio 2, for example, which had no Asian presenters, is getting an Asian presenter at the end of January. Five Live, Have Nihal and Naga Monchetti started at the beginning of January, which is great to see. So, there's already been changes made, and hopefully we'll see more of that in the next few months and years to come. So
are you presenting your findings to the networks?
Yeah, well, we're trying to engage anyone who'll talk to us and chat with them. Everyone we've talked to so far has been quite positive. Most people understand why things have got to change. So, as it stands, we've not had any kind of negative feedback from anyone. So, yeah, hopefully we'll see change. Well,
Mark, great work that you're doing, and thank you. And also thank you for sharing your experiences today with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I'd like to hear from you if you're at entry level, or whether you're working in the industry, whether it's across TV, radio or film, and you're from a diverse background. I'd really like for you to share your stories, your experiences. So please feel free to contact me and leave a message in the comments section. and I'll be happy to read those and share some of your stories too. For more details of who else I'm interviewing for my series Diversity and Inclusion in TV, Radio and Film, please feel free to follow me across my social media platforms and on YouTube. All that remains for me to say is thank you so much for joining us today, and see you next time.